The stagecoach driver warned her before she even stepped off. "Folks around here don't forget," he said. "And they sure don't forgive." She didn't understand what he meant, not until the gunshot cracked through the afternoon quiet. A man lay bleeding in the dirt. His horse stood riderless, and an entire town just watched. "That's Caleb Rowe," the blacksmith said. "Best leave him be." They said he sabotaged a mine. They said he murdered 23 men. But Eleanor Hale had spent 3 years as a war nurse. She'd watched surgeons let boys die because they wore the wrong uniform. She swore she would never again stand by while a man bled out, just because others decided he wasn't worth saving. So she ran to him. She pressed her cloak against his wound, and she made herself an enemy of the most powerful man in Silver Ridge. Victor Langford owned everything: the mines, the water, the sheriff, even the school board that just hired her. But here's the thing about Eleanor. She came west to escape her nightmares. She came looking for peace. She just never learned how to look away from injustice. Standing up for what's right when everyone else is sitting down is lonely work. But it only takes one person with courage to remind an entire town what they forgot. This story proves that fear is a choice, and so is courage. When powerful people depend on your silence, your voice becomes the most dangerous weapon of all. If you've ever had to stand alone for something you believed in, drop a comment and tell me your story. And if you want more tales about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, hit subscribe and ring that bell. Your support means everything. The stagecoach dropped Eleanor Hale right in the middle of that hard-eyed town. She came all the way from Philadelphia to be their new school teacher, hoping to outrun the ghosts of the war where she had served as a nurse. The coach driver gave her a simple warning. He said, "Folks around here do not forget, and they sure do not forgive." She did not understand what he meant, not until a single gunshot cracked through the afternoon quiet. In a heartbeat, Eleanor's nurse instincts took over. She saw the riderless horse and the man on the ground. She looked to the townspeople standing in their doorways, but they were like statues. "That is Caleb Rowe," a blacksmith grumbled, as if that explained it all. "It is best to leave him be." But Eleanor saw the man's hand twitch. He was still alive. Before she could think twice, she was running, her skirts catching in the tall grass as she rushed to his side. The smell of blood was thick in the air. "Can you hear me?" she asked, her voice steady and calm. His eyes, gray as a stormy sky, flickered open. "You should go," he rasped. She ignored him, finding the wound in his chest. "I was a nurse during the war," she told him, pressing her cloak against the bleeding. "I do not abandon my patients." He said his ranch was 5 miles away, a death sentence on foot. "We are getting you on that horse," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "I know you're hurt, and I know how to help. Right now, that is all that matters." Folks in Silver Ridge just stared and whispered as Caleb bled in the dirt, but the new schoolteacher, Eleanor Hale, wasn't about to watch a man die just because the town was scared of him. She got him up on his big buckskin horse, ignoring the blood that soaked right through her cloak. That is when a man in a fancy suit, Victor Langford, stood in her path. He said, "You do not know who you are helping." Eleanor looked him dead in the eye. "I know he is hurt, and I am a nurse. Now move. Sometimes doing the right thing means walking a lonely road. You have to wonder, what would you do?" Leading the horse north, Eleanor had to keep Caleb talking, or he would pass out for good. "Just 5 more miles," she told him. 5 miles, he repeated, barely a whisper. He told her the Creek Bend Ranch had been in his family since 1852, built by his own father. His folks were gone now, taken by a fever in the winter of '71. He coughed, and more blood appeared. "Why did you help me?" he asked. Eleanor did not hesitate. "Because I have seen too many men die who did not have to," she said simply, "and because nobody else would." As the sun touched the mountains, Caleb pointed with a shaky hand. "The cottonwoods," he breathed. "We are home." They were almost to the ranch when he grabbed her arm. "Eleanor," he said, his voice urgent, "helping me today, you have made enemies. You are going to need a friend in town. Find Mary Chen at the boarding house. Tell her I sent you." Before she could answer, the barn door flew open. A young man who looked just like Caleb ran toward them, his face pale with worry. "Caleb, what happened?" The boy was Jamie, Caleb's brother. They got Caleb inside and onto a bed, water, and a medical kit. "Now," Eleanor commanded. She cut away the ruined shirt. The bullet went clean through, but he was fading fast. With steady hands born of wartime practice, she cleaned the wound and began to stitch. She had sewn up more boys than she cared to remember. Caleb's eyes fluttered open once. "Told you I was dangerous," he mumbled. She just smiled a little. "Be quiet and let me work." When she finished, the wound was closed tight. But as she stood, her hands began to shake, a tremor she knew all too well. Jamie saw her. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She just clenched her fists. "I am fine. Just tired." The sun had long set and the sky was filling with stars. Eleanor knew she ought to head back, but the thought of that 5-mile walk was just too much. Jamie told her, "You cannot walk that trail in the pitch black." "Besides," he started, then trailed off. He looked worried. "Because you helped my brother Caleb, you have made an enemy of Victor Langford. People in Silver Ridge are scared of that man. He owns the biggest mine and controls the water. If he decides you are a problem, you will be one." "All I did was save a man's life," Eleanor said. Jamie shook his head. "You saved Caleb, the man Langford blamed for the mining accident that killed 23 men last year. Langford claimed Caleb sabotaged the number 7 shaft. The town believed him because Caleb would not sell Langford his creek water. So Langford turned him into the town villain. Eleanor had seen it before, how powerful men bend the truth. Now folks in town will not even look at Caleb. That is why I do not understand why you helped. You could have just let him be, let him die." Eleanor's voice was cold. "Is that what you think I should have done?" Caleb's eyes opened and focused right on her. "Still here?" he rasped out. She gave a small nod. "Still here." He warned her to head back to town before Langford decided she was not welcome. Eleanor just pulled a chair up close. "My feet are aching. I'm covered in your blood, and I'm not about to walk 5 miles in the pitch dark. I am staying." He called her stubborn. She just said she was being practical and needed to make sure her stitch work held. He looked her right in the eye. "Why did you really help me?" Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the dark window pane. She told him about her time as a nurse during the war. She explained how she had to watch young men, mere boys, bleed out on the ground while surgeons argued over which uniform they wore. She turned back to face him, her voice strong and clear. "I promised myself right then that I would never again stand by and let a man die just because other people decided he was not worth saving. I do not care what they accuse you of." A look she could not quite figure passed over Caleb's face. "You have no idea what that is going to cost you," he whispered before sleep took him again. In the kitchen, his younger brother Jamie handed her coffee and thanked her for saving Caleb no matter what trouble came of it. Eleanor refused the offer of a bed, choosing instead to keep watch in the chair. She had come to this town looking for some peace, a place to finally leave the war behind her. Instead, she had walked right into a new fight. It was the first real choice she had made in 3 long years, and she knew there would be a price to pay. Just as the sun began to rise, the fever hit him, and it hit him hard. She felt the heat just burning off his skin, and knew the night was far from over. "Jamie," she called out, her voice calm and steady. "I need you to bring me cold water and some clean cloths right now." When Jaime saw his brother, the color drained from his face. "How bad is it?" "We were expecting this," Eleanor answered, already tending to the gunshot wound. The hours that followed were a steady rhythm of cool cloths and quiet care. Caleb would drift in and out, muttering about water rights and collapsed mines. Jaime kept insisting she get some rest, but she shook her head, telling him he might as well call her Eleanor if they were going to be keeping vigil together. While she forced down a piece of bread, she looked straight at the boy. "Tell me everything about that mining accident. I need to understand what I have gotten myself into." Jaime's story came out in a slow, pained telling. It all started with Langford's number 7 mine, which was draining their creek completely dry. Their cattle were going thirsty, and their crops were starting to fail. Caleb had tried to settle the whole thing peacefully, but Langford wanted all the water for himself. When Caleb would not sell the land, Langford's men began to cause trouble, and the local sheriff, who was squarely in Langford's pocket, did absolutely nothing. Then the mine collapsed, and 23 men died down there. They said the support timbers had been sabotaged. Langford pointed the finger at Caleb, and the whole town believed him. There was no trial, no proof, Jaime said, his voice thick with emotion. Just Langford's word against my brother's. He swore on his life they were both fixing the barn roof that day, but Langford had paid an engineer to lie. Eleanor looked at the sick man tossing in the bed. Nothing about him felt like a man who could kill. She made up her mind right then. I need you to ride into town, she told Jaime. Let folks know I'm staying, and you find Mary Chen. Tell her everything. Jaime looked worried, but Eleanor gave him a tired smile. Langford already knows I helped him. Besides, I have a teaching position to claim at that school. I have to meet with the school board, Eleanor mentioned. The school board, Jaime repeated, his voice heavy. Victor Langford is the chairman. The words hit Eleanor like a punch to the gut. Of course he is, she murmured. After Jaime left, Eleanor sat with Caleb. His fever was high, and she spent the day keeping watch. She knew she had walked right into the middle of a fight. Langford ruled this town with money and fear, and Caleb was in his way. The mining accident was just a convenient excuse. Eleanor should have been figuring a way out of this mess. Instead, she found herself digging in her heels, just like she had always done. She heard a rough voice. Stubborn woman. It was Caleb. His eyes were open. How do you feel? She asked, moving to his side. Like I have been through hell, he rasped. He tried to sit, but she gently pushed him back down. You are staying put until that fever breaks. Yes, ma'am, he whispered. He asked about Jaime, and she explained he had gone to town. She added, and to tell the school board their new teacher is busy taking care of the town outcast. You should not have stayed, Caleb said, his voice stronger now. Jaime told you what Langford says I did. He told me what Langford claims, Eleanor corrected. There is a difference. Not here, Caleb insisted. You help me and you become his enemy too. Langford does not forgive. Good, she said, checking his bandages. Then people will know I do not back down just because something is hard. This is not about being hard, it is about surviving, he said, grabbing her wrist. His grip was weak, but his eyes were fierce. Langford has ruined good people for less than this. Then it is high time someone stood up to him, Eleanor said, freeing her hand. Caleb sighed. Not you. You just got here. You have your whole life ahead of you. I have a teaching job, she reminded him, maybe. I know this will cost me, Caleb. But the world only changes when folks do what is right, not what is easy. He looked at her for a long time. You sound just like my mother. Was she stubborn? Stubborn as a mule, he said, his eyes closing. She would have liked you. The war gives you scars, some on the inside. That is what Eleanor told him. Back in Philadelphia, her hands would shake so bad she could not hold a nurse's tools. She came out west, looking for a place where her help mattered more than a steady hand. She found Caleb bleeding out on the prairie instead. And now the whole town was in an uproar. Young Jaime rode up as the sun was dipping low, his face all serious. Mr. Langford called a school board meeting for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, he said. They are fixing to run you out of town for helping Caleb. Eleanor knew it was coming, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. Jaime added that old Doc Morrison, who is long retired, sent his regards. The doc said it was about time someone in town remembered what it meant to be decent. Well, that was something at least. Langford has this whole town in his pocket, Jaime warned her. He owns everything and everyone. Folks are too scared to cross him. Eleanor just nodded. Then tomorrow I will have to give them a reason to be more afraid of their own conscience than they are of him. That night, Caleb's fever finally broke. You ought to go, he said, his voice raspy. You got that meeting? I will leave at first light, she told him, her voice firm. He almost smiled. You are going to walk in there and tell them you are fit to teach their kids? She met his gaze. I am planning to walk in with my head held high. The blood will wash out. My principles will not. You are going to lose, he said flatly. Probably, she agreed. So why fight? He asked. Because, she said, standing up for what is right matters, especially when it is hard. It was a choice that could change everything, and Eleanor knew she had enough ghosts. Adding cowardice to the bunch just was not an option. Caleb was quiet for a good long while. Then he said, "My mama always told me courage is not about being fearless. It is about doing what is right when you are scared spitless." Eleanor smiled softly. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." His voice got quiet. She was. If she were here, she would be standing right beside you. "Then I will stand for the both of us," Eleanor said, turning down the lamp. "Now get some sleep." Her voice stopped him at the door. "Eleanor, no matter what happens, thank you. You reminded me that good folks still live in Silver Ridge." She just gave a nod, not trusting her own voice, and slipped out. Jamie had the coffee hot and ready when Eleanor came down before dawn. She had washed up with cold water, put on her plain brown traveling dress, and pulled her hair back tight. She looked ready for a fight. "I am riding with you," Jaime said, his jaw set just like his brother's. "You should not walk into that town all by your lonesome." Eleanor was grateful for the company. As they rode toward Silver Ridge, Jaime spoke up. "Whatever they decide, you have got friends here now. Me, Caleb, Mary Chen, Doc Morrison. We are not much, but we are something." "That is more than I had yesterday," Eleanor said, and she meant every word. They stopped at Mary Chen's boarding house. A small Chinese woman in her 50s with eyes that missed nothing opened the door. "Miss Hale, get in here. You too, boy. You both look like you could use a hot breakfast." The kitchen smelled of bacon and fresh bread. Mary poured them coffee without a word. "I heard what you did," she said, setting down plates. "Saving Caleb from that snake Langford. It was brave, but mighty foolish." "Seems to be my specialty," Eleanor replied. Mary's face softened a bit. "I knew his mother, Sarah. Good, strong woman. She would have done the very same thing." She sat down across from them. "Now, about this school board meeting. You know you are walking straight into an ambush, right?" Mary nodded. "Langford has it all planned out. He will say you are unstable, that you cannot be trusted with children. The rest of them will just nod along." "Who else is on the board?" Eleanor asked. "Reverend Mitchell, who owes Langford money. Samuel Cartwright from the general store, he is in debt to him too, and the mayor's wife, Margaret Thornton. She is less in his pocket, but she is afraid." "Any hope of swaying them?" "Margaret, maybe," Mary said, leaning in. "You have to make this about more than just Caleb. You have to make it about the soul of this town. Remind them what they are really voting on, whether they want their children taught by someone with principles or someone who just bends with the wind. You are a teacher, Eleanor. So go on and teach them a lesson." The meeting was in the back of the church. Eleanor walked in at exactly 9 o'clock, her back straight as an arrow. This was her fight to win or lose. Victor Langford sat at the head of the table looking smug in his fancy suit. The others sat beside him, looking like nervous sheep. "Miss Hale," Langford said, his voice slick as grease. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Eleanor took the one chair facing them all, feeling like she was on trial. "We are here to discuss your actions yesterday," Langford started. "You gave aid to Caleb Rowe, a man we suspect of sabotage and worse." "He is an accused man," Eleanor said calmly. "Not a convicted one. Under the law, he is innocent." Langford's smile got tight. "Details. You put yourself in danger to help a wanted man. I am a healer. I gave medical care to a man with a gunshot wound. That is not being dangerous. That is doing my duty." "A duty that shows poor judgment," Langford shot back. You rode into town yesterday, and by sundown, you took sides with a man this whole community has turned its back on. What I did, Eleanor said, her voice steady, was show basic human decency. When I see a man dying, I help him. That is not poor judgment. That is being human. Reverend Mitchell cleared his throat. But Miss Hale, a teacher, must be above reproach. Parents will not want their children taught by someone who sides with criminals. Then those parents should ask themselves why they just stood there and watched a man bleed out. Eleanor's voice cut through the quiet. And they should ask why you care more about how things look than about teaching children right from wrong. The room got real still. Are you suggesting, Langford said, his voice low and threatening, that we do not know what morality is? I am suggesting that morality is about what you do, not just what you say. Eleanor looked him square in the eye. You stood by and chose fear over mercy. What kind of lesson is that for your children? That is enough, Langford's calm finally cracked. You know nothing of our struggles. I know you lost 23 men in that mine. Eleanor's voice softened. I know it was a terrible tragedy. But using that pain to go after an innocent man is not justice. It is just plain vengeance. You have no proof he is innocent, Samuel Cartwright mumbled. And you have no proof he is guilty, Eleanor shot back, turning to each of them. Is that what you want to teach the children of Silver Ridge? That an accusation is the same as a conviction? Margaret Thornton finally spoke. What would you teach them, Miss Hale? I would teach them to ask questions, Eleanor said, meeting Margaret's gaze. I would teach them to stand for what is right, even when it is hard. I would teach them that courage is doing the right thing, and I would lead by example. Noble words, Langford sneered, but not practical. The world is built by people who refuse to trade their principles for convenience, Eleanor said, standing up. I know you are fixing to vote me out. But before you do, think about what that vote really means. Not for me, but for your children. For the kind of town Silver Ridge will become when fear wins. She walked to the door and turned back one last time. I saved a man's life yesterday. I would do it again tomorrow. Not because I am reckless, but because it is the right thing to do. If that makes me unfit to teach in your eyes, then cast your vote. But know this, you are not voting on my fitness. You are voting on your own. She found Mary Chen waiting on the church steps after the meeting. I told them the truth, Eleanor said, sinking down beside her, feeling bone-tired. I do not think it did any good. An hour later, the Reverend found them. Miss Hale, the board has made its decision. The position is yours. Eleanor just stared. Turns out Mrs. Thornton was mighty insistent. She said her daughter deserves a teacher with some backbone. The vote was 3-1. After he left, Mary smiled a knowing smile. Langford does not take losing very well. He will be watching you. I know, Eleanor said. And that evening, as the mountains turned purple, she borrowed Mary's horse and rode back out to Caleb's ranch. Jaime met her at the barn, his face full of worry. Everything all right? Eleanor swung down from her horse. I kept the job, for now. 3 months probation. She found Caleb on the porch, a blanket across his lap. He was pale, but when he saw her, his whole face changed with relief. You're safe. And I'm still the teacher, she said, sinking into the chair beside him. Margaret Thornton has more grit than I gave her credit for. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Thank you, he finally said, his voice raspy. For what? For standing up there and telling the truth. Most folks would have folded just to save their own hide. Well, I'm not most folks. As the stars began to pop out, she knew she should head back to town. But sitting there, she felt like she had finally found a place worth fighting for. I'll be back in a couple days. Doctor's orders. He just smiled. You take care of yourself, Caleb Ross. You too, Eleanor Hale. She rode into the darkness, ready for whatever came next. The one-room schoolhouse smelled like chalk dust and old pine. 16 little faces stared back at her, a mix of curious and suspicious. The gossip had beat her there. "Good morning," Eleanor said, her voice calm and steady. "I'm Miss Hale, your new teacher. I reckon y'all have heard some stories about me. Some might be true. Most are probably stretched. But none of that is as important as what we are going to do in here." A lanky boy of about 13 raised his hand. "My pa says you saved the man who killed all those miners. Is that true?" She looked right at him. "I gave medical care to a man who'd been shot. The law, not me, will decide if he's guilty. My job was to keep him from dying, and I did my job." She picked up a piece of chalk. "In this room, we deal with facts, we ask questions, and we think for ourselves. Now, let's get on with introductions." The air in the room didn't clear completely, but it shifted into something she could handle. Her days fell into a simple pattern. She taught reading and arithmetic to children who were slowly coming around, and every third day she would ride the 5 miles out to Creek Bend Ranch. Checking on Caleb's wound was a welcome break. With every visit, he seemed a little stronger, and the careful task of changing his bandages always took a bit longer than it needed to. "You're healing up real well," she told him during one visit, looking at the clean scar. "Another week, and you will not need these bandages at all." "I suppose that means you will stop coming out here," Caleb said, his gray eyes watching her. "The medical necessity will be over," she agreed, carefully wrapping the cloth. "But then again, you are one of 3 people in this whole town who looks at me like a person instead of a problem." He gently took her wrist. "Is it really that bad in town, Eleanor?" She let out a long breath. "It is not good. The parents are just watching, waiting for me to make one wrong move. The women from the church act like I have the plague. And Langford," she said, her voice tight. "He has started showing up at the schoolhouse. He calls it observing my teaching." Caleb's expression turned to stone. "What is he looking for?" "Any little thing he can use to fire me. He just sits in the back of the room taking notes like a judge. It is driving him mad that I am actually a competent teacher." "Good," Caleb said, handing her a cup of coffee. "You are a lot tougher than you look, Eleanor Hale." They drank in a silence that felt easy and familiar. "Tell me about the water," she said suddenly. "Everyone talks about it, but nobody explains why it matters so much." Caleb stared into his cup. "My father came west in '52. He picked this spot for one reason: the creek. It is fed by mountain springs. It flows strong all year long when other streams run bone dry by August." He nodded toward the window. "Then the mines came. And mining uses more water than you can possibly imagine. It has always been about the water," Caleb explained as she tended to his wounds. "Langford's mines drink thousands of gallons a day from the same water that feeds this creek. The year he opened them, our water level dropped 2 feet. He wanted to buy my water rights, to take it all and leave us with nothing. When I said no, he found another way to get me off this land. The mine collapse that killed 23 men was his answer. He had his engineer testify that I sabotaged the supports. The water dispute gave me the motive." "Tell me about the engineer," Eleanor said, her eyes sharp. "His name is Robert Fletcher," Caleb answered. "Why?" "Because a war nurse learns to recognize when a man is lying," she said, leaning in closer. "And every time I hear that engineer's name, something just does not feel right. Any real engineer who found sabotage supports would shut that mine down fast, not wait until 23 men were dead." Eleanor paced her kitchen. "He didn't find sabotage because there wasn't any. It was an accident." Caleb watched her. "You believe Victor Langford framed me for murder just to cover up his own shoddy work? When the mine collapsed, he needed a fall guy, and you were already on his bad side." Eleanor faced him squarely. "Caleb, he will come after you twice as hard if you start asking these questions. He will destroy you." "He is already trying to destroy me," Eleanor said, her gaze steady. At least this way I am fighting back. This is not your fight. It became my fight when I saved your life. I cannot teach children about justice while watching an innocent man get railroaded." Caleb reached out, his calloused hand gentle on her cheek. "You barely know me." "I know enough," she said, not pulling away. "I know you grieved for those men. And I know when you look at me, you just see Eleanor. That is more than I have had in a long time." Just then, a voice called from the yard. "Rider coming?" On the porch, they saw 3 horsemen approaching. Sheriff Porter was in the lead. "Stay behind me," Caleb said quietly. "I will not." The riders stopped. Porter looked like a man who would rather be anywhere else. "Caleb, Miss Hale." "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" "Got to ask some questions. There was another incident at the number 7 mine. Langford thinks you know something about it." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "When?" "Last night," the sheriff said. "Where was Mr. Rowe last night, Miss Hale?" "He was right here, recovering from a gunshot wound," she snapped. "The man can hardly walk to the barn. He sure did not ride 15 miles to a mine." Jamie stepped out from the barn. "I can vouch for that. He was here all night. I helped him to bed myself." Porter sighed. "Look, Langford is talking about bringing in federal marshals to investigate damage that popped up right when he needed it." Caleb's laugh was bitter. "It is mighty convenient timing, and I have got witnesses saying I was nowhere near that place." Porter nodded slowly. "I will put that in my report. But Langford has the governor's ear. He will not stop until he gets what he wants." "Then I reckon we are at a standoff," Caleb said, his jaw tight. "I am not selling my land." The sheriff mounted up. "Your funeral, Rowe." After they left, Eleanor told him, "That was a threat. He is getting desperate because you are not backing down, which means we need to act first." Eleanor found Doc Morrison at his shuttered practice. "Heard you were making waves, Miss Hale," the old doctor said. "Takes some real grit to do what you did. May I come in? I need to ask about the mining accident." His face turned serious. "I examined some of the men before Langford's doctor from Denver took over, and I found things that did not match the sabotage story. The injuries were all wrong for that." Eleanor leaned in. "How?" "Sabotage leaves tool marks, cuts, or drill holes. What I saw suggested the timbers just failed under pressure, splintered from the strain, not sabotage." "Did you tell the inquest?" "I tried," Morrison said, his face clouding over. "The Denver doctor said my eyes were failing me. Langford backed him up so the official story stood." "But you kept your notes." "I did." He handed her a leather journal from a locked drawer. "Everything I saw is in here, my professional opinion. Be careful. Victor Langford is a snake when cornered." "Why are you helping me?" "Because I took an oath to seek the truth," he said with a sad smile. "Same as you, I imagine." Eleanor spent the evening reading the doctor's detailed notes. He was right. The patterns proved the supports had simply given way. Fletcher, the engineer, had lied. But why? A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Mary Chen from the boarding house. "You have a visitor downstairs. It is urgent." In the parlor, a pale Margaret Thornton was waiting. "Miss Hale, thank heavens," she said, twisting her gloves. "I must speak with you." "My husband got a letter from the governor's office," Margaret said, her voice stretched tighter than a fiddle string. "Federal marshals are coming to investigate the mines. They think Caleb is a saboteur." Eleanor felt her stomach clench. It was Langford. He had powerful friends and had painted Caleb as some kind of monster. Margaret met her gaze, her eyes full of fear. "They're going to arrest him the second they get here. The trial will be in Denver, where Langford owns the courthouse and everyone in it. They plan to hang him." The words hit like stones. "Why are you telling me this?" Eleanor asked. "Because you're the only one tough enough to face that man. And because I know something." Margaret leaned in close. "I overheard Langford arguing with my husband. He was mad about costs and bragged about using cheaper timbers than the plans called for, saying no one would ever know." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. "Are you sure?" "I wrote down every word," Margaret said, pulling a folded paper from her purse. I was afraid to speak up then, but now I'm more afraid of what happens if men like Langford always win. With Margaret's note in hand, Eleanor knew going to the local sheriff was useless. He was deep in Langford's pocket. When the law is broken, you sometimes have to find your own path to justice. She found her friend Mary in the kitchen. I need to borrow a horse, Eleanor stated plainly. I'm riding to Denver to talk to a newspaper editor I know. Mary didn't even pause. Where are you going? If the law won't listen, maybe the people will. It's Caleb's only shot. That's a dangerous ride to take, Eleanor. Langford will crush you if he finds out. He's going to try anyway, Eleanor said, her voice firm. I'd rather go down fighting than waiting. Mary studied her for a moment, then gave a firm nod. Take the gray mare. She's got more heart than any horse in the county. Just be careful. Before the sun had a chance to rise, Eleanor was riding south toward Denver, carrying a small bundle of truth in her saddlebag. She found the editor, James Mitchell, in his busy newspaper office. He was a man she'd met during the war, a fellow who valued truth more than money. He listened to her whole story without saying a word, his eyes scanning the notes she brought. This is quite the accusation, he said at last. Langford is one of our biggest advertisers. Running this story could put us out of business. Eleanor felt her newfound hope start to crumble. But, Mitchell continued, his smile grim, we'd go out of business with our integrity, and that's worth more than his dirty money. Give me 2 days to check a few things. She rode back to Silver Ridge, feeling a spark of possibility. But when she arrived, the town was in an uproar. Nailed to the church door was an official notice. The federal marshals were coming ahead of schedule. Caleb Rose was to be arrested immediately. Well now, back from your trip, Miss Hale. The voice belonged to Victor Langford. He stood at the edge of the crowd, a smug look on his face. He knew. He had probably known she was leaving before the horse was even saddled. I hope it was educational, he said with a chilling smile. Very, Eleanor shot back, meeting his cold eyes. Too bad it won't make a lick of difference, he chuckled. Justice, Miss Hale, is just a word powerful men use. The sooner you learn that, the easier life will be. He tipped his hat and strolled away, confident he had won. The marshals were on their way. Caleb would be in chains. Unless Mitchell's story came out in time, an innocent man was going to hang. Eleanor looked at the damning words on the notice one last time, then swung herself onto the gray mare. She pointed the horse north and rode for Creek Bend Ranch. Whatever was coming, Caleb deserved to hear it from her. They would face it together the way they had faced everything else, with courage and a stubborn refusal to let evil win the day. I know Langford sabotaged that mine himself, Caleb stated, his hands pausing their work. I have proof. Morrison, his foreman, kept a journal. How do you know? Eleanor asked quietly. Because I took that journal to a newspaper editor I know in Denver. She stepped out of the shadows, feeling the weight of it all. Langford found out, and this is how he is hitting back. You went to Denver without telling me? Caleb's voice was tight with anger. I would have stopped you. You are darn right you would have, she shot back. Do you have any idea what you have done, Eleanor? You have put a target right on your back. I was already a target the second I helped you. I do not need you to protect me. I need you to trust me. She pulled the journal from her saddlebag. The paper is going to print the story. It might not be in time to stop an arrest, but it will be enough to make a federal court listen. Caleb took the journal, his anger fading. This could destroy you, Eleanor. Langford will make sure you never teach again. Then I will go somewhere else, she said, meeting his gaze. But I will not watch an innocent man lose everything because I was too scared to do what is right. Why? He asked, his voice raw. Why risk it all for me? She could not tell him the whole truth, not yet, not with everything so uncertain. Because it is the right thing to do, she said simply, and because somebody has to. He set the journal down, real gentle, and his gray eyes locked on Eleanor. He said, I can't let you throw your life away on my account. "It is my life to throw," she shot back, stepping closer. "Caleb, I spent 3 years running from the war and the folks I could not save. Coming here was meant to be a quiet start, but running just puts off the inevitable. Standing up for you, for what is right. This is the most honest thing I have done in a long time." Caleb took her hand in his. "You are the bravest woman I have ever known. I am scared to death." "That is what makes it bravery," he said, pulling her near. "If this all goes south, you have to promise me you will walk away." "I cannot promise that," she said, her voice full of fire. "I will not abandon you." He leaned down and kissed her, slow and careful. She rose up and kissed him back with all the fear and hope bottled up inside her. When they parted, he rested his forehead on hers. "I do not deserve you." "Probably not," she smiled, a little shaky. "But you are stuck with me now." They knew the marshals were coming, so they had to be ready. Caleb refused to run, as that would just prove Langford's lies. The plan was simple. Eleanor would keep teaching, Mary and Doc Morrison would dig for more proof, and Jamie would ride out to the other ranches to quietly gather support. "It is not much of a plan," Jamie admitted. "It is what we have," Eleanor replied. "Hope and the truth are all we have got right now." She rode back to town under a sky full of stars, her heart feeling heavy and light all at once. Mary was waiting for her with tea. "The marshals are on their way," Eleanor told her. "We will face it together," Mary said, her voice solid as a rock. "You are not alone. Folks are on your side. They are just too scared to say it. Men like Langford, they seem powerful, right up until the moment they ain't. The trick is to be there to see them fall." For 2 days, Eleanor taught her classes, but her eyes were always watching the road. On the morning of the third day, she saw a rider meet with the sheriff. The law had finally come to town. Her heart sank right to her boots. The marshals were here. That morning, she taught her students in a complete fog. Around noon, Sheriff Porter appeared at the schoolhouse, a troubled look on his face. He told Eleanor the marshals were heading to Creek Bend to arrest Caleb that very afternoon. He warned her they knew she'd been helping and that Langford had already filled their heads with lies. The sheriff, looking uneasy, admitted things had gone too far and advised her to be careful. He urged her to have any proof of Caleb's innocence ready, because once they got him to Denver, the truth would be buried under Langford's money. With that, he left. Eleanor knew what she had to do. She sent the children home early and rushed back to the boarding house. She and Mary rode out to Creek Bend as fast as they could. They arrived just as 3 federal marshals rode up. The lead marshal, a hard-faced man named Carter, got off his horse. He announced he had a warrant for Caleb's arrest for sabotage and murder in the deaths of 23 miners at the No. 7 shaft. Caleb calmly read the warrant, then handed it back. He pointed out it was based on the word of a man employed by Victor Langford, the very same man who'd been trying to steal his land for 2 years. Marshal Carter was not interested. He told Caleb to come peacefully. Caleb agreed, insisting that the truth would eventually come out. As they put the cuffs on him, Eleanor couldn't stay quiet any longer. She stepped forward, telling Marshal Carter she had evidence that proved the mine collapse was an accident caused by poor construction, not sabotage. Carter gave her a dismissive look. He asked if she examined a lot of mining accidents. Eleanor stood her ground, explaining her experience as a war nurse gave her the knowledge to tell the difference. She mentioned another doctor's report that supported her findings. Carter simply told her to present it at the trial. Helpless, she watched them lead Caleb away. He met her gaze, his eyes showing not fear but a firm resolve. They rode off, leaving Eleanor, Jamie, and Mary standing in the settling dust. Jamie was terrified they would kill Caleb, but Eleanor promised that would not happen if they could help it. Their only hope was to get to Denver and have their friend Mitchell publish the true story in his newspaper. Langford controlled the local telegraph, so riding was the only way. Mary warned her that by the time they got there, it might be too late. Eleanor refused to just stand by and do nothing. Mary saw the determination in her friend's eyes and agreed to go. They rode hard, pushing through the pain and exhaustion, because every second mattered. They finally reached Denver close to midnight and pounded on the newspaper office door until Mitchell answered. Eleanor quickly explained that the marshals had taken Caleb. She begged him to publish the story that very night, to expose Langford's scheme before a trial could be railroaded. Mitchell looked at the evidence they had brought. He told them the presses were cold and it would take hours to get a paper printed. Eleanor insisted they start right away. Seeing her fierce resolve, Mitchell agreed. They could have papers on the street by dawn. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Mitchell woke up his entire staff. While he wrote the story with blistering speed, Eleanor and Mary organized all the evidence. Soon the giant presses began to rumble to life. As the sun started to rise, Eleanor held the first copy. The headline was bold: "Mining Disaster or Murder." The article laid out all the facts, from medical testimony to suspicious timing, creating a powerful story of a man being framed by a ruthless tycoon. It was the truth, plain and simple. 2 hours later at the federal courthouse, a crowd of people holding the newspaper were buzzing on the steps. A clerk posted a notice. The hearing was postponed because of new evidence. Relief washed over Eleanor so strongly she almost fell. A voice called her name. It was Marshall Carter. He knew the newspaper story was her doing. Eleanor met his gaze and said the evidence was always there. It just needed to be seen. Carter studied her for a long moment. He said that in his 15 years as a marshal, when a powerful man like Langford pushed so hard for an arrest, it often meant he had something to hide. "I believe a man who is that invested in a conviction has something to hide," Carter said. "So, you think Caleb is innocent?" "I think this whole case stinks," the lawyer answered, rolling a cigar in his fingers. "The hearing is pushed back a week. If you have got more proof, now is the time to find it. Caleb is in the federal holding cell. You should probably let him know he has got some decent help now." The jail was a grim, smelly place. Caleb looked up when Eleanor approached his cell, his face a mix of relief and worry. "You published the story," he said. "We just bought ourselves some time," she told him, gripping the cold iron bars. "We need real proof that Fletcher lied about the sabotage." "The mine records," Caleb said suddenly. "Langford keeps records for everything. If Fletcher used cheaper timber, it will be in the paperwork. His office at the mine is locked up tighter than this jail," he added grimly. "What about Fletcher himself?" Eleanor asked. "Langford pays him too much, and he is too scared to talk." "Everybody is scared of something," she said, squeezing his hands. "We just have to figure out what Fletcher is more scared of than Langford." She left the jail with a new plan taking shape. She and Mary found Doc Morrison at his home. "How is he?" Mary asked. "He's holding up," Eleanor said. "But we need those mine records to prove Langford used bad materials. I think I know how we can get them." The doctor listened as Eleanor laid it all out. "You want me to request the records?" he asked when she finished. "As a doctor investigating the deaths of those men, you have a right to see them," Eleanor explained. "If Langford refuses, it makes him look guilty. And if he agrees, we get the proof we need to clear Caleb." Doc Morrison stared into his coffee cup for a long moment. "I tried to speak up after the collapse," he said quietly. "They called me an old fool." "They will not dismiss you this time," Eleanor insisted. "Not with the whole country reading about this. I know you are scared, Doc. But 23 men died, and an innocent man is in a jail cell. We have to stop him." The old doctor looked at his trembling hands, then back at her. "We are the only ones who can make a difference now." He met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw the spark of the man he used to be. Doc Morrison, the town's healer, walked into the courthouse expecting the truth. Instead, he ran into a stone wall. A clerk with a sour look informed him the records on the mine collapse were sealed. Sealed by the governor himself, all because Victor Langford asked him to. Standing beside the doctor, Eleanor felt her stomach drop. Langford was one step ahead, blocking them at every turn. The weight of it all hit her later, back in her room. Her hands started shaking again, an old tremor brought back by fear and exhaustion. Her friend Mary sat beside her, taking those trembling hands. "You are not falling apart," Mary said, her voice firm. "You have been running on nerve and coffee for days. Doing this while you are scared does not make you weak, Eleanor. It is what makes you brave." Doc Morrison was not a man you could just dismiss. He spelled it out for the courthouse official. "Let me get this straight. A disaster at the mine kills 23 men. My medical findings contradict the official story. But when I ask for records that could prove what happened, they are sealed to protect the very man who benefits from hiding the truth? The doctor did not wait for an answer. That is not an investigation. That is a cover-up. Outside, their next step was clear. The law was not on their side. They needed someone on the inside. Doc thought for a moment. "John Spencer," he said. "He is the new mine foreman. His younger brother died in that shaft, and he never quite believed the official story." Eleanor knew what she had to do. "I'm just going to ask him," she told Mary. "Ask a man who lost his brother if he wants the truth to come out." She found John Spencer at the mine, a stout man with grief etched deep into his face. He knew her as the teacher who saved Caleb. "I am the teacher who's trying to find out what really happened to your brother," she said softly. She explained that 23 men died because someone cut corners to save $1. Then she showed him Doc Morrison's journal. Spencer's jaw grew tight as he read about the injuries that did not match a deliberate blast, but instead pointed to a structural collapse. "If this is true," Spencer said, his voice thick with emotion, "then an innocent man is sitting in a jail cell." Eleanor met his gaze. "I need proof, Mr. Spencer. Those records are the only thing that can prove it." He looked at the dark entrance of the mine that had taken his brother. "I will see what I can do," he finally said. "We have 6 days. That evening, Eleanor told Caleb everything when she visited him in his cell. She told him about the sealed records and about Spencer's dangerous promise to help. "I am not running from this fight," she said, her hands pressed against the cold bars. Caleb reached through, his fingers wrapping around hers. "What happens after?" he asked quietly. "If we win this?" Hope and fear hung in the air between them. "Then we build something," she whispered back. "Something worth all this fighting. You and me." The next 3 days crawled by. The town was fractured. Some folks pulled their children from her school, while others offered quiet nods of support on the street. Then, on the 4th day, a young boy from the mines showed up at the schoolhouse door. His face was flushed with urgency. "Miss Hale," he panted. "Mr. Spencer sent me. He said he has what you need. He said to meet him at 9 o'clock tonight down at the old smelting shed south of town." Eleanor's heart just about jumped out of her chest. She told the messenger she would be there. The rest of her teaching day was a blur of nerves and excitement. The minute the school bell rang, she found Mary. Spencer came through. "I'm meeting him tonight to get the records." Mary's face clouded over with worry. "Eleanor, a late-night meeting in an abandoned building sounds like a trap." "It might be," Eleanor said, "but it might also be the very thing that saves Caleb's life." She had to take the risk. "Well, then, I am going with you," Mary declared. They rode out at 8:30, the setting sun painting the mountains behind them. The old shed was a wreck, a relic from the town's early days. They got off their horses a good ways back and walked the rest of the way on foot. Inside, a match flared, revealing John Spencer's terrified face. He clutched a leather portfolio. "I got them," he whispered, shoving it at Eleanor. "The records, the orders, the fake inspection reports, all of it. This proves Langford used cheap wood, and Fletcher signed off on it, knowing it was a death trap." Just then, the shed door flew open and lanterns flooded the dark space. And there, with Sheriff Porter and 3 deputies, stood Victor Langford himself. "Well, well." Langford's voice was as smooth and cold as a snake. "Miss Hale, I had a feeling you were behind this little theft. And Mr. Spencer, I am so disappointed in you." Langford's smile was pure ice. "Sheriff Porter, I want them both arrested for theft and conspiracy." The sheriff took a step forward. "Miss Hale, I am going to have to ask for that portfolio." Eleanor's mind was racing. If she gave it up, the proof was gone. But then Mary Chen stepped out from the shadows where she had been hiding. "I do not think so, Sheriff." Mary's voice was steady and clear. "I am a witness here, And what I just heard was Victor Langford admitting those papers contained proof that his negligence killed 23 men. That is not what I said, Langford snapped, his composure finally cracking. It is exactly what you implied, Mary shot back, standing beside Eleanor. And I am ready to testify to that fact in a federal court, under oath. The shed fell silent. The sheriff looked from Langford to the two women, his face a mess of confusion. Sheriff, Eleanor said calmly, these documents are evidence in a federal investigation. Seizing them would be obstruction of justice. I plan to deliver them to Marshal Carter in the morning. Porter made up his mind. That sounds like the proper way to handle it, he said. Langford's face turned dark with fury. I am ordering you to arrest these people, Porter. On what charge, Mr. Langford? Porter's voice was firm now. Miss Hale is right. This is a federal matter now. And frankly, sir, I am starting to think she has been right about a lot of things. You will all regret this, Langford snarled. Maybe, Porter said, stepping aside to clear the doorway, but I will regret it with a clear conscience. Y'all are free to go. Eleanor clutched that portfolio to her chest and walked out with her head held high. Langford's threats were just empty noise behind her. She had the proof. They rode hard through the night, straight to Denver. By the time they arrived, the sun was just beginning to touch the horizon. Eleanor went straight to the federal courthouse, bone-tired but determined. Marshal Carter was already at his desk. Miss Hale, you are here awful early. I have evidence, Eleanor said, placing the portfolio on his desk. Proof that the mine collapse was caused by greed, not sabotage. Carter opened the portfolio and slowly looked through every single page. The orders for cheap timber. The signatures of Fletcher and Langford approving the deadly cost-saving measure. The silence in the room was heavy. Finally, the marshal looked up. Where did you get these? From a man whose brother died in that collapse, Eleanor said, meeting his gaze. 23 men died because Victor Langford wanted to save a few dollars, and then he blamed an innocent man. Carter tapped a thick finger on the documents. This is explosive if it is authentic. It is authentic, Eleanor promised. I intend to find out, Carter said, closing the portfolio. The hearing is tomorrow at 10 o'clock. If this evidence holds up, Miss Hale, Caleb will walk out of that courtroom a free man. Relief washed over Eleanor so powerfully she nearly fell over. She went to see Caleb in his cell, telling him everything. It is really over? He asked, his voice thick with hope. After tomorrow it will be, she whispered, pressing her hand against the cold bars. When you are free, he began, his eyes shining, I am taking you to the prettiest place I know. Caleb's gray eyes held hers firm. Stay with me tonight, he pleaded, his voice barely a whisper. I do not want to be alone in here. So she did. Eleanor sat on that cold stone floor, talking with him until the guards finally told her to leave. At the door, Caleb's voice stopped her. Eleanor, no matter what happens, thank you. You were the only one who saw the man, not the monster. She could not speak past the lump in her throat, so she just nodded and left. The next morning, the courtroom was packed tight. Victor Langford sat right up front, looking confident between his slick lawyers. When his eyes met Eleanor's, she saw nothing but pure, cold fury. She just lifted her chin and stared right back. Suddenly, Marshal Carter walked in with other marshals and a sharp-dressed older gentleman. This hearing is now in order, Carter declared. Given the new evidence, I have brought in Judge Marcus Brennan to oversee things. Judge Brennan's sharp eyes scanned the room. Marshal Carter, let us hear it. Carter laid out the evidence piece by devastating piece. He proved that Langford had ordered cheaper, weaker timbers for the mine to save money. He showed how the inspection reports were lies. Then he called Robert Fletcher to the stand. The engineer was pale and sweating, his confidence gone. Under questioning, Fletcher broke down completely. I did what Mr. Langford told me to do, he confessed, his voice cracking. He promised me bonuses. After the collapse, he threatened me. He made me blame Caleb Rowe. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. When it was Eleanor's turn, she walked to the front, steady and calm. The judge told her she did not have to speak, but she insisted. "I want to, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear. "This is about a town so gripped by fear of one man that they would let another die on the street." Eleanor's voice cut through the courtroom clear and steady. She accused Langford of trying to ruin her career, all to keep her quiet about the mine. "I have seen good men die because of the choices of powerful men," she declared. "During the war, I swore I would never again stand silent while innocent people suffered for someone else's greed." She pointed right at Langford. 23 men are dead because Victor Langford put his money before their lives. He then destroyed an innocent man to cover his tracks." The judge's gavel struck like a gunshot. "Order!" Once the room was quiet, he called for the defendant. "Bring in Caleb Rowe." Caleb entered in shackles, his shoulders tight with pain and pride. His eyes immediately found Eleanor's. The judge looked at him. "Mr. Rowe, do you have anything to say?" Caleb stood tall. "I did not sabotage that mine. I knew those men. They were my neighbors." His jaw was set like stone. "When they died, I mourned." "Then Victor Langford called me a murderer. He took everything from me because I would not sell him my water rights." Caleb turned from Langford back to the judge. "I am not asking for pity. I am asking for the truth to matter. I am asking for justice for those 23 miners." A heavy silence fell. Judge Brennan then asked, "Marshal Carter, your recommendation?" Carter's reply was sharp. "Dismiss all charges against Caleb Rowe immediately, and open a full criminal investigation into Victor Langford for the deaths of 23 men." The judge nodded. "Mr. Langford, stand." Langford's composure finally broke as the judge spoke. "The evidence shows a pattern of negligence and a conspiracy to hide the truth. You will surrender your passport and remain here." Then, turning to Caleb, he said, "Mr. Rowe, you are free to go. The court apologizes for this injustice." The gavel fell, and the room erupted. Eleanor pushed her way to Caleb as guards unlocked his shackles. The moment he was free, he pulled her into his arms. "It is over," she whispered. "You did this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me." She looked up at him. "We saved each other." In the weeks that followed, justice began to take its course. Langford was formally charged with negligent homicide. His powerful name could not protect him now. Back in Silver Ridge, Eleanor found the town had changed. Folks who had shunned her now greeted her with respect. Parents who had pulled their children from her class asked her to take them back. "You made us see how fear was running our lives," Margaret Thornton told her over tea. It was not a comfortable lesson, but it was a necessary one. Eleanor taught with a new sense of purpose. One afternoon, a young student named Thomas Cartwright stayed after class. "Miss Hale, I am sorry for believing the lies about Mr. Rowe," he said, his face earnest. "You taught us to think for ourselves." Eleanor smiled gently. "The important thing is that you are thinking now. That is what learning is all about." Every Sunday, Eleanor rode out to Caleb's ranch. They would talk for hours on his porch, their friendship growing into something more. One evening, walking by the creek, Caleb took her hand. "The water is ours now," he said. "We can share it, help our neighbors. It will be a lot of work." He stopped and turned to her. "I was hoping you might want to help me with it." He saw the question in her eyes. "I am not asking you to give up teaching. I am asking if you would consider making this place your home. If you would marry me, Eleanor." The proposal was as honest and straightforward as the man himself. She felt tears welling up. "I still have nightmares," she admitted softly. "So do I," he said, his thumb brushing her cheek. "We are both scarred. Maybe that is why we fit together. We understand what it means to survive." He told her she could keep teaching, that they would build a life that honored both of them. And looking at this good man, under a wide Texas sky, Eleanor knew she was home. "Yes," she said, "yes, I will marry you." "My mother would have flat out loved you," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "She always said us Rowe men needed strong women to keep us on the straight and narrow." Eleanor smiled right back. Well, lucky for you, I'm real good at keeping folks honest. They were married 6 weeks later, right there by the creek under the big cottonwood trees. It felt like the whole town came. Doc Morrison, his hand shaken a bit but proud, was the one to give her away. Jamie stood by Caleb, grinning so wide you'd think his face might split in two. The only important person missing was Victor Langford, who was sitting in a Denver jail cell, finally answering for the 23 souls he'd put in the ground. Their vows were simple and true. "I promise to stand with you," Eleanor said, her voice clear as a bell, "and to fight for you, and to choose you every single day." Caleb's voice was rough with feeling. "I promise to see you, just Eleanor, and to build a home with you where the truth matters more than being comfortable." The party that followed was a happy mess of folks and food. Tables groaned under the weight of beef from the ranch and pies from neighbors who, not long ago, wouldn't have given them the time of day. As the sun started to dip low, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Caleb took Eleanor by the hand. "Come on," he said softly. "There's something I need to show you." He led her up the creek to a quiet meadow high in the mountains. There, a series of clear pools bubbled right up out of the earth. "This is the start of it all," Caleb said, his voice full of reverence. "The spring that feeds our creek, that keeps the ranch alive. This is what we were fighting for. Not just the land, but the very source." Eleanor looked from the pure water to the man standing beside her. "It is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she whispered. Caleb shook his head, a tender smile on his face. "No, ma'am. The most beautiful thing is you standing right here, choosing me in this hard life." She stepped closer and put her arms around him. "I think we both understand that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being scared to death and doing the right thing anyway." They stood there under the stars and talked about their future. Eleanor would keep teaching the town's children, and in the summers they'd work with Doc Morrison to get a proper medical clinic started for all the families scattered out in the country. "I want children," Caleb said out of the blue. "Someday." Warmth bloomed in her chest. "Me too. Children who will know their father was a man who chose what was right over what was easy, and that their mother was a woman who saved lives when everybody else just looked away." Hand in hand, they walked back down to their wedding party, returning to the laughter and the music, their new life together just getting started. Life settled into a good, steady rhythm. Eleanor spent her days either at the schoolhouse teaching the children to ask hard questions, or working beside Caleb on the ranch. Her hands, which had trembled for years after the war, grew strong and capable again with purposeful work. The little clinic they set up in an old outbuilding became a blessing for folks for miles around, a place where people were treated with dignity. News finally came down from Denver that Victor Langford had been found guilty. He would spend the next 15 years in a territorial prison. It wasn't enough to bring back the dead, Eleanor thought, but it was real justice all the same. Without Langford's heavy hand, Silver Ridge began to breathe again. New families moved in, and the whole town started to feel like a community. It was a new beginning, not just for them, but for everyone. Things in Silver Ridge were finally starting to look right. The water rights Caleb had championed were now law, serving all the ranches fair and square. The town even had a new, honest-to-goodness sheriff. As her friend Margaret said, Eleanor's courage had shown everyone else how to find their own. She had come looking for a quiet life, but found a different kind of fight. One with truth, not bullets. And she hadn't won it alone. Caleb was waiting on the porch when she got home. After helping her down from her horse, he asked about her day. She smiled, telling him how one of the schoolboys was learning to think for himself, leaving his father equal parts proud and horrified. Caleb just kissed her forehead, his eyes full of love. That night, young Jaime, now a capable 17, surprised them both by cooking a whole chicken for supper. He grinned and said he reckoned he needed to learn if he ever wanted to find a good wife. As they ate, Eleanor felt a deep sense of peace. This was more than a house. It was a family. Later, walking by the creek, she told Caleb her dream of expanding the small clinic into a real medical facility for families in the area. He did not hesitate for a second. He told her he did not marry her to make her smaller, but because her big heart made the world a better place. So they built it together. The seasons turned, filling their lives with teaching, healing, and quiet evenings. Then, one spring morning, Eleanor woke up knowing she was carrying Caleb's child. When she told him that evening, his face lit up with a joy so fierce it took her breath away. He gently touched her stomach and whispered, "A baby, our baby." She covered his hand with hers, understanding that love was not about rescuing each other, but about standing together, side by side. Their daughter Sarah was born in January, with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes. Holding that tiny baby, Eleanor knew what real healing was. It was not forgetting the past, but building a future so bright it was worth every single scar. Old Doc Morrison looked over their newborn girl and declared her perfect. Caleb just grinned, saying she had his stubborn streak right from the start. In the years that followed, they had two more children, Jamie and Margaret. The Creek Bend Ranch prospered, its water shared fairly with everyone. The little clinic Eleanor started grew into a real medical center. Silver Ridge changed completely. It was no longer a town living in fear, but a community built on respect, because folks learned to stand together. One evening, long after their children were grown and making their own way, Eleanor and Caleb sat by the spring where it all began. He looked at her and asked, "Do you ever regret it? All the chances you took?" Eleanor thought about the scared young woman she once was. "Not for a single second," she said, leaning against his shoulder. "We built something good out here, Caleb. Something honest." His arm came around her. "It all started because you refused to let me die on that prairie." She smiled. "It started because you were worth saving, and I was just plain tired of running from the hard things." They watched the sun dip low. Two people who had built a beautiful life from wreckage. They had proved that ordinary folks with enough grit could stand up to power and win. Their story showed that scars do not stop you from finding happiness, and that the right choice, even when it costs you, is always the right choice. The stars came out one by one in the vast Texas sky, watching over two people who had fought for what was right and had built a love that was stubborn, fierce, and would surely endure. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.